All right, guys, we just want to welcome back to the Everything College Football podcast. Today, me and Nick will be looking at the Clemson Tigers and is this offense ready to get back to elite status to where they were in, the Trevor Lawrence era. And, of course, the years before that, this was a very sound offensive team. And it's just been a bit of a disaster over the last couple of seasons ever since Lawrence departed. DJ Uiagalelei, of course, was a massive disappointment for them. That certainly led to a lot of stagnation in their offense for a couple of seasons in this past season. With the addition of Garrett Riley, the numbers were actually a little bit worse than they were in 2022. But I think most people that watch this offense at times felt that there was more confidence. The weekly balance, I thought, was better, especially over the final month of the season. They did have an handful of ugly games, though, for this offense. Miami, Wake Forest, the NC State game wasn't great. Especially since they had a quarterback starting his first season, seems like they have much more upside momentum than they did the last 2 years, Nick. They have had exactly 22 turnovers in each of the last 2 seasons, though. It plagued them versus Duke, costed them against Florida State big time, had 3 turnovers against Miami also. All those games, they quite frankly should have won, Nick, this offense. Still a lot of ugliness, but again, even though the numbers are slightly a little worse than 2022, I think there's a lot of positives working in their favor, especially in Riley's second year.
There are some solid vibes heading into year 2 under Riley at this point in time. Klubnik obviously is a young kid, is going to continue to develop as a passer. Another practice season in the spring under his books will certainly help with him with that. They scored 26.8 points per game this past year, 59th in the country. And at that number, I think the biggest issue when I look at these stats is they were 71.15% in red zone scoring, 127th in the nation. That's an abysmally low percentage there, and that's something that's a problem. You cannot score in the red zone in tight games. You're going to lose games all the time. You need to find a way to convert on those tough drives down the red zone. If you're not able to do so, if you're doing below 75%, that's a bad number. Certainly 127th in the nation is not great. The yards per game was 379.7, which was 68th in the nation as well. These are numbers that are far lower than what they were during the Trevor Lawrence era. I think Klubnik's a fantastic quarterback. We're going to go over his stats and talk about him here a little bit in a second. I think he has potential to continue to grow and be a really solid prospect. We need to see him hit those heights this year for this offense to take that next level.
Yeah, that red zone offense you allude to, they actually were 100% in scoring offense in the red zone in 4 of the last 6 games. So they certainly got better as the year progressed. And again, that kind of alludes to the momentum we're talking about. The Kentucky game was very impressive for this offense, but kind of a moot point back to the opener. We picked Duke to beat Clemson, but we didn't think that they would go 1 of 4 in the red zone. I mean, they just kept costing themselves, Nick. It was absolutely mind-blowing, incredibly frustrating as a Clemson fan. And it's stuff like that, just complete nonsense, quite frankly, that led to them losing that game, only scoring 7 points, left a lot on the table, including a victory. And, looking at Cade Klubnik, obviously, this is a guy who was a former number 1 ranked quarterback, this past season really showcased his ability to throw the ball downfield with great precision. The arm strength checks out, the mobility in terms of throwing on the run, making some good plays as a runner. Those are things that really stood out. He made some good throws versus the blitz as well. He needs to be more consistent in that area. One game I watched specifically was the NC State game where he had a pick against that said blitz. He was forced to throw fast, didn't get his feet set, and the throw sailed on him for an interception. The wide receiver wasn't exactly open, but he could have been given a nice solid chance if his feet were set. That was also on first down as well. Stuff like that really costs this team, and they lose a lot of close games, and it always happens to be when this offense struggles. It seems the game was really predicated, the one against the Wolfpack, that is, on the quick passing game. Some of the more complex Tony Gibson concepts really took a toll on this offense. The wide receivers in that game had to make some tough grabs. And that's just one game I watched because, there's a very tough defense, and that was kind of a stretch for Klubnik, where he certainly struggled, especially with the turnovers, 64% completion rating. Obviously, we're going to allude to the offensive line a little bit later, and that's certainly something he's trying to adjust to, is working with an offensive line that's really inconsistent. Cade Klubnik, no, Nick, just focusing on him, he got a little reckless at times. You've seen it throughout the year, and obviously he's trying to make plays. You can't fault a kid for doing that. There was at times where the offense was just incredibly stagnant because there was not much available downfield. I think it was 120, it was 118th nationally in 30-plus yard passing plays. So there wasn't a lot downfield for most of the year, and he's certainly trying to work this quick passing game, and at times it just didn't work.
It just didn't work at times, and that was an absolute disaster for this offense. The turnovers were a problem. 9 interceptions for him. Not a great number. 19-9 ratio. TD to interception ratio is not great. 63% comp rate. 2,800 yards total. He gets a little uncomfortable in the pocket, a little bouncy. It seems like he doesn't have his feet set. He loses his focus a little bit and makes poor decisions, throws the ball into tough areas. We saw multiple turnovers in that game against Duke that you alluded to earlier, down in the red zone, that cost the team. sailing the ball over wide receivers in crucial moments, underthrowing other wide receivers, just a little uncomfortable top to bottom. Klubnik's got to be the guy. They really don't have any depth on the depth chart. Christopher Visna is a quarterback out of Alabama who was highly rated, but we don't really know what to expect out of him, and he wasn't even the best prospect in the state when he came out. So I think, they're going to have to rival Klubnik here. He's going to be the guy at this point in time. He needs to step up, though. If he's not playing great football, this offense is going to struggle. The run game, they're not going to be able to rely on it as much as they have in the past, in my opinion, this year. So Klubnik's got to be firing on all cylinders if this offense wants to have any success in the ACC.
And he came a long way. He got that start in the Orange Bowl in 22 against Tennessee, and they couldn't score in that game either, where they got in plus territory every single possession, and a lot of mistakes Cade made certainly led to them leaving points on the board. 7 interceptions for him over the final 7 games, so, kind of being reckless there. And they did win a lot of those games, though, so I do want to allude to that. But it was more so from a balanced approach. Cade Klubnik, though he's entering his second year as a starter, I think a lot of people are expecting big things from him. And I think we're going to get less sporadic play. I think he's going to be more consistent. He's certainly going to have his best season yet. Speaking of this run game, they had 3 straight games of 200-plus yards to end that 2022 season, and that carried over for about the first 7 games, but they were nowhere to be found in those games against Miami, NC State. Refound its bread and butter, though, versus Notre Dame with only Phil Maffa in the backfield, and then they again had 3 200-plus yard games in November to round out this season. I would say this run game's been pretty impressive the last 2 years, Nick, because I'll certainly allude to the offensive line struggles later. And obviously, this is tremendous in helping them with their balance. But with Will Shipley departing, that's going to leave Phil Maffa to man this backfield solo. Maffa, a big, powerful back that has good open field speed for his size. Really good on inside zone runs, but was very good on counter run plays. Proved to be very effective often on those concepts. Really like his one-cut ability while continuing to move upfield as well. That game he had against Notre Dame was flat-out elite, Nick, because that was the only game Shipley missed all season long. It was only his second career 100-yard game. He had a good bit of 80 and 90-yard games in his career, obviously splitting touches with Shipley. I think he's going to eclipse that number plenty more this season, the 100-yard mark that is. But that's a beautiful sight, Nick. Shipley doesn't play in the game. This guy gets a career-high 36 carries, turns in a career-high 186 yards. And it seemed like they're probably going to struggle versus a great front 7 without Will Shipley, a versatile running back. I mean, this is right after they struggled 2 weeks in a row to run the football. Nick Maffa explodes against, again, a great front 7. Very good sign there. I was one that picked Clemson to win that game against Notre Dame. If I recall, I think you were on the other side. And the reason why is because you just didn't have any faith in this run game. Very impressed with what they were able to accomplish on that day.
I did pick Notre Dame in that game because I was worried about the rushing attack of Clemson, and Maffa blew away my expectations. Hats off to him. He had a fantastic game and had a really solid season, 965 for him and 13 touchdowns on the ground, plus 100 yards receiving as well. But now he's got to be that featured number 1 back. Will he be able to take on that mantle fully? The depth chart down below, Jay Haynes is the number 2. Doesn't really have a whole lot of touches, only had a few touches, about 35 yards and 1 score in limited actions last year for the redshirt freshman. He's going to now be the number 2 back. I like Maffa a lot. I think he has a ton of potential to succeed in this offense, but he is the guy at this point in time. There's no more Shipley, who was a dynamic back, who was also really solid in the red zone. This is going to be a tough transition, in my opinion. I think it's going to be, you're going to see a slight, drop in production for this running room, but I do like what they have here. I think Maffa's an incredible back, top to bottom. I love the speed, the cut he has as well, the vision. If the offensive line can hold up and make holes for him like they did in that Notre Dame game, he can find a lot of success on the ground this year. I just wonder if he'll be able to take on that extra load and be able to keep that same momentum throughout the entirety of the year.
Yeah, looking at the other part of this supporting cast, the pass catching group was much better than expected. We've been critical, pretty heavily the last 2 seasons on how they just haven't recruited the position very well. They've needed guys to step up, and that's what they gotten, and I feel greatly confident in what they have heading into this season. They managed very well without Antonio Williams last year. Only had 22 grabs in 5 games. He was beat up all year long, and, I think certainly that lowered the ceiling for this passing attack. But the good news is he has an entire offseason to get healthy. He's going to come back better and with more guys around him. Certainly a negative that he was not able to stay on the field, but I think it's certainly a positive for this future season as it gave other guys an opportunity to get on the field, and he's going to have a clean bill of health. Tyler Brown, he was an unsung hero early on in the season. Didn't have a single game over 50 yards over the final 6 games, though. They did go 5-1 in those contests. A pure slot option, a speedster that can win deep. They try to get him going in the short game as much as possible. He's real dynamic on those screens. He runs some nice corner routes as well. Good quickness on in-breaking routes. He had a great game versus a talented secondary in Florida State. I remember running him in DraftKings against Syracuse, and he put up a career high. I think it was about 140 yards in that game. A guy that was just winning deep consistently. Alongside him, though, you got two incoming freshmen, five-star TJ Moore from Tampa. Great hands. He can win vertically. Does a great job tracking the ball. His body control is impressive. A lot of people are fans of his yak as well. He should continue to get bigger. He's about 6'3", 195 or so right now. And Brant Wesco, people are higher on him, I think, than Moore. A high-end four-star, hit a nice touchdown in the spring game. I believe it was the over-the-shoulder fade route. A guy who does a good job winning the top of his routes. He's also considered a vertical threat. They can, make plenty of acrobatic catches. Two incoming freshmen right here, Nick, finally getting some momentum. That's what we've been talking about the last couple of seasons, and glad they accomplished it in this year's cycle. Antonio Williams back, mixed in with the emergence of Tyler Brown. I'm getting really excited, Nick, of what we have here.
This is a wide receiver room that is a lot better than the last two seasons. I think Garrett Riley being involved as well has helped recruiting as they brought some more talent down there to Clemson. They were struggling to recruit any sort of talent. I believe at one point their only wide receiver they brought in was a 3-star. They were not able to bring in any talent at all, and now they bring in those two highly rated freshmen that you were talking about, TJ Moore and Bryant Wesco. Look at Moore, you throw him in the slot. I think he can really be functional in the slot with Tyler Brown, who is only a sophomore at this point as well. Brown and Moore will split time in the slot. I like Brown a lot, 531 yards receiving and 4 scores, leading the team last year, a really talented player. And Wesco, he's a really solid player that you can put the Z position, very movable. Antonio Williams, if he's fully healthy this year, we can see him finally be uncorked. He looked really great in the 5 games he played last year, 224 yards receiving and 2 touchdowns, but the injuries caught up to him and played an issue for that. They also have a solid tight end returning in Jake Brenningstool, who had nearly 500 yards receiving and 5 touchdowns. Troy Stilillo as well as returning. He had nice production for 321 yards on 38 grabs. So they're having a nice supporting cast. A lot of guys returning. So Klubnik has thrown to these guys before. He's comfortable with them and brings them back at this point in time. I like this wide receiver room. It's certainly a lot better than it has been in the past, even without Bo Collins, who moves on to bigger things. This offense could be very solid with Klubnik under the helm.
Bringstool, 6'6", 230, a lean tight end. They like to get him the ball underneath whenever he's in line. He played out of the slot, though, for nearly 60% of his reps. Very slippery in getting behind the defenders. Runs lots of quick out routes, hitches, just to get the ball in his hands. Good speed in the open field. He's an athletic guy. Dabo calls him pro-ready. I think a lot of people are shocked he did opt to return to school. Another note on Antonio Williams is he's a guy who runs plenty of short routes. He has nice toughness. I think this is a guy that can really potentially fight for 70 receptions this year. That production hasn't been saw in a long time for Clemson. I think Williams, though, certainly going to be that guy that looked to target at least 10 times a game. Troy Stiletto, he had 58 targets last year. Didn't have great production, though. This is another veteran they're getting back along with Adam Randall. A guy that they've talked about, Clemson fans as, a good route runner. They like his separation ability. And I also hear how he's a hard worker. And I think that's great, especially for this program to have a guy who's going to, put in the work to get better. So I'm assuming he's had a big offseason, Nick. Again, I allude to that excitement with the freshmen coming in, potential for Williams as well. But getting some depth pieces like Stiletto, Randall, and a tight end who might be the nation's best, this is just phenomenal work right now. I got to, flip the script when the evidence is there. This is completely different than what we were at 12 months ago.
It is completely different. I think Garrett Riley plays a role, and I alluded to that just a few minutes ago. This is huge for this team, right? They can continue to bring in talent and develop that talent like they used to. Clemson used to produce a ton of wide receivers in the NFL draft, guys taken in early rounds, Sammy Watkins, players like that. Now they have struggled to do so in recent times since Trevor Lawrence has left. Their production has really been poor. Justin Ross was the last great wide receiver for that offense, in my opinion. Since him, they really haven't been able to produce any sort of talent that was productive week in, week out. They have a ton of guys this year that are really exciting to watch. Bringstool, also, I like him a lot as a tight end, pro-ready guy who returns. He could have a huge year this year. I like the way they move him underneath. A really solid tight end, in my opinion. This offense has some nice weapons here, some really solid guys in the slot I'm keeping my eye on. I like the way that they're going to be able to run this offense this year.
You're right. Guys like Watkins, T. Higgins, Justin Ross, just, some great lineage in the past at this position. Looking at the offensive line, obviously I think this is going to play a big role in what they're going to be able to accomplish this year. They returned 4 starters. The unit was good, I think, in terms of run blocking, especially in those games like Notre Dame. But one thing that doesn't really seem to get talked about heavily is this is a program that is far off compared to the other, elite programs in college football, your Georgias, your Ohio States, your Bamas. And it's been like this for a few seasons, Nick, and it's that we're not putting guys in the NFL at all when it comes to the offensive line. I've counted only 5 players drafted up front since the 2014 draft. None of them being elite contributors at all, mostly day 3 picks. Jackson Carman, he was a former 5-star who was, a round 2 selection a couple years back. He's a backup guard at this moment in time for the Bengals. He's just never been the bread and butter for Dabo in this program. They've always had, plenty of good football players, right? But it's never been about the guys up front. And the development right now certainly seems to be costing them a little bit because, when they were winning and competing for national championships, again, a nice starting five of good, tough-nosed, disciplined football players. And right now, that sentiment certainly has faded a little bit. Will Putnam, their best player at center, he departs. Marcus Tate, he's going to move over to that center position. And we got the projected line on the screen. Tristan Lee, a former five-star left tackle. I mean, that's really pretty much all you know about him, right? He hasn't really evolved into anything. Blake Miller, I thought he was very impressive for them at right tackle. This interior, though, I mean, these guys like Tate, Walker Parks, these guys are veterans. They've been around a long time, and the development just kind of seems capped at this moment. They were only 39th in sacks. I think they really stepped up from time to time. But the consistency's not there. The progression's not been great. And I remember when they played Georgia a couple years ago, I was like, they're going to significantly struggle in this game. But they only had 2 rushing yards, Nick. I didn't think they would be that poor. That shows where they're at on the interior of this offensive line. It's really just disappointing. And again, it's never been Clemson's thing, but this kind of seems to be like an all-time low.
This is a poor offensive line. I am a little concerned about this. I look at this top to bottom. I have some worries. I think Marcus Tate moving into center could work out, but Will Putnam was the best player on that offensive line. You're replacing him, and that leadership, that's tough. Walker Parks, a graduate senior, a guy that's been around for a while, so he's your big veteran guy to rely on at right guard. Blake Miller at right tackle and Tristan Lee at left tackle are 2 guys I worry about. I think they're both a little weak on the outsides there. I think that, blind side could be an issue. Then Colin Sadler, the youngest player on the interior, has Trent Howard behind him on the bench as well. If they want an extra little bit of experience playing at left guard, they want to make a rotational piece. Sadler could potentially kick out to left tackle as well if he needs to. I'm not super confident in this offensive line. I think this offensive line is not super deep and doesn't have the talent or the size they need to compete in the ACC. I think they would get run over in the SEC with an offensive line like this. And they play Georgia early on next season in week 1, so we'll be able to see what they look like matching up against a massive defensive line from the SEC. I just don't think this offensive line looks great this year for Clemson.
Yeah, I mean, the game against Kentucky, they did have 4 rushing touchdowns. The game Shipley did play in, but he only had 29 yards and 11 carries. And you talk about SEC, that's a physical front Kentucky has with a lot of size. And, yeah, they did absolutely nothing against it for the most part. Losing Putnam's big. I do know Marcus Tate last year was a great pass blocker. I think he's going to be one of the better centers in the country. He's come a long way, certainly. Like you said, I certainly understand some of the concerns. Harris Sewell played about 500 snaps from right guard. Right now, he's kind of penciled in, I think, as a backup on the interior. So we'll see how it plays out. And like you said, we're going to find out real quickly against Georgia what this offensive line is made of. And we'll watch some more tape before we preview this team in full in a couple of months. So just kind of a rundown of, our current assessment of this offensive line. Overall, I think this Clemson unit is marching forward, Nick. I definitely think they're getting closer to regaining that elite status. But I don't want to set the bar too high, even though I think Cade, a former 5-star quarterback who has a flurry of weapons, has a nice running back, and an offensive line that did showcase its ability to be capable of making some big lanes in this conference. I think this is an offense that should easily approach 35 points per game. Should certainly be at that 450 yard per game mark, I would say. I would expect the balance to continue for them. Those too high of expectations, Nick, because if they want to compete, they're going to have to meet them.
I think those expectations are a little too high at this point in time, just based on what I saw last year. I think, closer to that 30 points per game mark is where I think they should get to 400. I think 400 is very achievable at this point in time. They're at 380 last year. They should be able to get to 400. I'm concerned about this offensive line. I'm concerned about the run game. Behind this offensive line, I think Klubnik will be all right. I think he'll continue to grow into his game. He's got a great weapons. If he can't make it work with these weapons this year, then you have to start asking questions about whether or not he is the guy down there in Clemson. Again, I don't know what you do from there because their quarterback room is kind of weak, and Dabo's not going to go out in the portal and grab a quarterback if Klubnik struggles. This offense, I think it's got potential to boom, but I think it's got potential to bust as well. It's going to be one that I'm going to keep my eye on throughout the season.
Yep, 380 yards per game against FBS opponents. And obviously, they ran it up against an FCS opponent to kind of boost those numbers significantly. But yeah, this is an offense I'm very excited for, Nick. It should be a pretty good year for Clemson. If not, it's going to be really tough. A lot of questions to be answered. But overall, I think they're certainly doing the right things in terms of, continuity. And I think there's going to be a lot of growth here to take shape. It's going to be it for today's episode. As always, Nick, I appreciate you joining me talking the Tigers.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing how this offense can develop in the new look ACC.
Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.